Hello everyone, I hope all are safe. It's very good to get back to our classes. So we start from where we stopped. The government budget, the government debt, and the limitation of fiscal policy. And actually this topic is very important nowadays. Because of coronavirus, every government globally, all the countries in the world are facing problems, so they are having fiscal policy to save private sectors, to save the economy, increase income, whatever. So they have many targets to do that, okay? And they will face huge deficit for next year's budget. So very interesting topic. But before I get into this, I want to remind you some important things, so you need to know them, okay? So basically, what do we mean by fiscal policy? So it is simply the government's action to stimulate the economy. But how they do it? Stimulate the economy through change in tax or government expenditures. Okay. Also we have monetary policy. It's the same, government's action to stimulate again economy through change in, this time is money supply or interest rates. So whenever we talk about fiscal policy, it means like government is decreasing tax or increasing tax, okay? Or government expenditures, spending is increasing. They want to spend increasing. So now every government in the world, because of the coronavirus, that lockdown and the pandemic, like had a huge negative effects on the economy. So they are increasing their expenditures nowadays. They are borrowing huge money, like in the United States, $2.2 trillion right now, and they are spending on private sectors and other sectors. And even they did decreased the interest rate. Okay. So let's get into our class. The government budget deficit, like United States faced a huge deficit in the recent decades. Here are some examples and why actually. So one of them was during 2003 to 2001 and 2003. So that happened because they cut tax, they decreased tax. Okay? So tax is the revenue of government. If you decrease tax and your expenditures remains the same, then there will be a deficit. And also that was because of 11 September's attacks. The government starts to fight terrorism in the world. Okay, because of war on terror, they increased the military spendings by trillions of dollars. Therefore, this causes a budget to face a deficit. So, and how deficit occurs actually. Here are some other notes I want to share with you. If government expenditure is greater than tax revenue, then there is a deficit. If government expenditure is lower or smaller than tax, then there is a surplus. So when the government is spending more than its revenue, there will be a deficit. But if the spending of government is less than the revenue, which is tax revenue, there will be a surplus. Okay, so another shortage, another deficit was in 2008 in response to the global economic crisis. At that time they cut the tax revenue. Tax revenue declined, and then because of stimulus package at that time, which was billions, 787 billions at that time. So they increased their spending, government expenditure increased, and tax was decreasing. So they faced a deficit at that time as well, in response to the global economic crisis, to save the private sector and the economy. Okay, We said that, if you remember, in chapter 2, we have the magic equation. Okay, so the difference between tax revenue and government expenditure equals to private saving and investment, and net export actually here considered as foreign investment. Okay, so any change here happens from tax revenue or government expenditure, there should be a change over here to rebalance the equation. Let me give you an example for that. Assume tax is 500 minus the government expenditure, let's say 450, equals, and here we have investment, let's say 250 plus net export on foreign investment 250 minus 450. Okay, so this side equals to this side. Okay, what if the government revenue tax decreased by 25 billions? Let's say it decreased to 475 minus, and the spending is the same. So something here should change. Okay, so those factors are the factors that can rebalance the economy and cover the deficit. Okay, so there are suggest three ways to finance the deficit. Any of these: private savings can go up or come down, investment can fall, foreign investment can fall. Okay, so it's important to know any action of the government increasing the spending or increasing tax, cutting tax, whatever they do, any action of fiscal policy has the effect on the future generations. And how? So those will be rebalanced, those will be the future generation, the future taxpayers will pay for these actions today, because in the near future the government will increase tax. How? The budget deficit increases the total debt. When there is a deficit, immediately government will go to borrow money for this deficit. And then how they pay back for this debt? They have to increase the tax in the future. So the next generation will pay for the deficit now, will pay for the debt. Here is the difference between real government revenue and government expenditures. Okay, so as you see, this line is government revenues, this line is government expenditures. Whenever you see the expenditures above the government revenue, there is a deficit at that time. Okay, this covers 110 years. So the Great Depression was here. Actually, they were safe during that time. But during the war, look at this. the government expenditure was greater than the government revenue by almost 20%. Okay? The same is for the Second World War over here. Okay? So again, during 80s there was a deficit over that time, over those periods. 3 years, 1998 I think, 9 and 2000, there was a surplus over here. And then due to the 11 September attacks, again become negative, and then that followed by the global economic crisis. So we see most of the time there is a deficit. Most of the time. Here is real government expenditure, real government revenues, and real budget deficit over here. So at the point of zero, no deficit and no surplus. Whenever you see this line above the straight line, there is a surplus. Above zero, we have surplus over here. So overall, most of the time, the United States government had a deficit. Okay? Budget deficit. Here is from 1970 to 2010. So over 40 years there was a deficit, except 3 years. By the way, deficit is not that much harmful for the government, because they can borrow and spend to raise income and consequently to rise GDP. Okay, so what are the types of deficit? What are the types of deficit? So we have a few types of deficits. Structural deficit, which is so-called natural employment deficit as well. Structural deficit is when the deficit is continuous for some time, like this, for some period. Okay? And we have cyclical deficit, is the amount by which the actual government budget deficit exceeds structural deficit. So it's a difference between actual deficit and structural deficit. This will happen due to change in the economy. Okay? So actual deficit is a combination of cyclical deficit and structural deficit. You should know that. Okay? And then the difference between actual deficit and structural deficit is cyclical deficit. Cyclical deficit is happening due to the business cycle, like economic fluctuations during a short period. or any change in the GDP for short periods. Okay, so I want to mention something else, like before I skip to other ones. So when there is a deficit, the government spending increases and transfer payments increases as well. And consequently, tax will decrease. Transfer payments. Okay, it's important to know that. Now, okay, we know and we learned that what's the deficit? What's the deficit? Okay, and now how the deficit recovered? How the economy stabilized? How the budget stabilized? Here is the equation that tells us how the budget stabilized. Okay. Here we have T minus G. It means tax revenue minus government expenditure equals to tax per income minus government expenditure. So the budget deficit will be stabilized, will be recovered by increase in income. Okay? If the income increases, tax will increase. So the small tax is government tax, and the capital tax is tax revenue for government. And this one is income tax, actually. So as income increases, tax will increase as well. So the government increases, having the spending the same. Okay? So if income increases, helps to restrain expansions. If income decreases, the tax revenue decreases, which helps to dampen the recession. Okay? That's how it will stabilize. So it's heavily depends on income. So this graph tells us the relation between income and budget, surplus or deficit. Now, here we have tax 0. So at 0 point there is surplus, below the 0 point is deficit, and this line increases. This line is a linear relationship between income and tax and surplus. So when income increases from Y1 to Y2, the budget line increases from B to A due to the change in income tax over here. that rises up, then the budget will be rebalanced to the 0 point where there is no deficit. Of course there is no surplus, but we are coming from deficit to up there. I'm repeating. When income increases from Y0 to Yn, okay, this point, the income tax increases as well, and consequently the budget increases from B to A. Okay, so there is a strong correlation between income tax and the budget line. Very important. And now we are the same. That was the previous position. Does the budget influence the economy? Does the economy influence the budget? Is there a relationship between the budget and natural economy? As we can see, this is the difference between the this is the budget deficit occurs, okay, natural employment deficit over here. When the government expenditure increases, when the government expenditure increases, the budget line shifts to the downward. So that was the initial budget line and shifts to this line. Okay, no matter if government or income increases, there will be again a deficit. That's so-called natural employment deficit, which is the structural deficit at the time. At the same time. So to conclude this graph, when the government expenditure increases, the budget line shifts to the downward to this, and no matter if income increases, there will be a deficit. Okay? There will be a deficit. So if the government increases the expenditure, that will grow the economy. Okay, income increases. Okay, that's fine. But the budget will be deficit again. So here is a comparison of the actual budget and natural employment budget for 1970 to 2010. Natural employment surplus is this line, and actual budget surplus is this line. So you can see both are moving together. So the difference between them, okay, the difference between these two lines is cyclical deficit due to the change in the economy for a short period between these years. Okay, so let's say actual surplus is over here, natural surplus is over there. So it means like cyclical effect, cyclical surplus or deficit was negative over here. here cyclical negative is positive. Why? Because actual budget surplus is above the natural employment surplus. Okay, so that was about the deficit of the government and surplus budget line. Okay. Now we move to debt. What are the debt? I don't wanna get. Okay, so we will cover this as we are supposed to do. The debt is simply how much the government owes. Nowadays in the United States, I think there is about $25 trillion debt. So how much government owes? Okay, they have to pay it back. So gross debt is the same as public debt. The word of public means government of the country, state. Okay, government liability. So financial obligations that should be paid back. The gross debt is the same as a public debt. Net debt subtracts. So there are two kinds of debt. So about 30% of the government debt is from the government institutions, such as Federal Reserve, trust funds, Social Security and Medicare. Those governmental organizations, okay, are the lenders, creditors. But the rest will be raised from the financial markets through issuing bonds. So the net debt differentiates between those two. Okay? Now, what about the burden of these debts in the future? Are they that will be effect on the infrastructure of the countries? No. The only cost, the only burden in the future is the interest plus the debt principal repayment. Okay? It's very important to know how the purpose of these debts for the government and how they spend it. So they should spend in a way to generate returns for public benefits. That's very, very important. But the only burden is to repay the interest plus the principal in the future. Okay? So, what about the solvency of the government? Can government go solvent? Remain solvent? Always owe some money? Has no reserve? This situation, so these equations are adjusting for what I want to try to say. The government will not be solvent. The government can be solvent, but if the economy, the GDP grows over years, so the ratio of debt to GDP can increase as well, and there will be no risk on the government. Okay, so by the same amount, the GDP can grow as debt growth. That's what happening in the United States, and which is very, very important actually. State the solvency condition states that the government can meet its interest bill forever by issuing more bonds without increasing the debt to GDP ratio, only if the economic growth rate P plus Y equals or exceeds its actual nominal rate. So the government is expected to pay back the debts, and the debts is expected to increase by the same percentage that GDP increases. Okay, we will solve some problems on this and you understand better what we are talking about. So here is some example. So debt is 9 trillions, for example. This is an assumptions. And P plus Y equals 5%. Stability, D equals 5%. So this is allowable for deficit of 450 billions. So if the ratio is 5%, the deficit can be by the 5% amount, which is 450 billions. As I said, I will solve problem on this and you understand better what we are actually talking about. Here we have international perspective, like this is the ratio of debt for these countries over the GDP of these countries as well. We can see like Italy is always suffering from high ratio debt. Some days, some years that exceeds 100% of GDP. Okay, and here's Japan. This is dramatically increasing to reach even 120% of the GDP, but doesn't matter, and whole the world knows that Japan's economy growing. As long as the economy grows, the debt can increase. Doesn't matter, because it will be used to stimulate the economy. Okay. And here is Germany. They are enjoying a low level of debt. United States are stable, a kind of stable, like fluctuating between 20% to 40 something percent, except the period of the financial crisis. And this definitely increases nowadays in 2020 due to the coronavirus outbreak. Here is in focus and explaining the 40 years. Actually, not 40 years, it's 200 years. This one is 40 years. So there, yeah. During the period of war, Second World War, for the United States, it exceeds the 100% of GDP. So it means if the GDP, if the total economy products was 100,000 billions, they had a debt of 1,100 billions. But look how they decreased and lowered this ratio after the war. Yeah. And then increases. But no matter with this increase, that happens due to the economic growth. So what about the multiplier effect? Okay, so this slide is important for you to know, like, you know, what's multiplier effect. An increase in the government spending, how much stimulates the induced income. So any government spending, any dollar that government spends as extra, there should be an increase in induced consumption. Okay, but there are some factors that lowering these effect, like leakage from the spending stream, income tax, imports, corporate profits, and higher interest rate that can reduce the effect of the multiplier, fiscal policy multiplier. So fiscal stimulus is much more appropriate and effective when the economy is weak. Okay, so during the normal time, when the economy is enjoying a stable growth, the fiscal policy is not effective at that time. But after the or during the period of weak economy, like global financial crisis, or I would add something here, COVID-19, for example, the economy is very weak, and these government spending through the transfer payments will stimulate the economy, and the multiplier effect is very high, and the fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus is very, very effective. Here's the stimulus, fiscal stimulus during the global financial crisis. So, and the multiplier effect, okay? So it means the fiscal policy increased the consumption by this amount, 1.74 times. Okay, temporary increase in a food stamps, the expenditure, extended unemployment insurance, and other stuff over here. So the highest was increase in food stamps. Okay. What about size of fiscal stimulus measures in 2008 to 2010? Percentage of this. So they cut tax, Mr. Bush, George W. Bush, and the rebates was 1.2 of percent, 1.2% of GDP. And then Bush went away and Obama came. So he also cut tax in response to the global financial crisis. And the tax was, this action was by 1.4% of the GDP. And then there was fiscal policy through increasing in the expenditures for infrastructure and related spending, transfer payments to the government, and transfer payments to the unemployment benefits and other components. So the total stimulus was 7.6% of the overall GDP of the United States in order to save the US economy. So the role of the automatical stabilizers over here. So real personal disposable income increases in this amounts, okay, percents. And we have here real personal income less current transfers. Personal consumption was here. Okay, so now let's focus on the personal consumption. Declined by about 2% and then recovered after 2010 to get it to zero, to get it to the level of the pre-crisis anyway. The thing is, we can see here personal disposable income was too high, but without the government transfer, the personal income was here. The transfer is the stimulus package. Like people lost their job and the income declines, okay, by this amount because there was no job. Several and many of the companies went bankrupt, closed, shut down. The laborers were laid off, go home, there's no job. So government had to pay to those laborers, to those workers, until they get another job. This is so-called transfer payments, okay? So with the transfer payments, the income was increasing by 1%, 2%, and like this. But without those transfer payments, the income would have been declining almost by 6%. So now we see the effect of stimulus package through expenditure, through the increase in the expenditure of the government via transfer payments. Okay, so this is the real income, but without the transfer payment, without the government's support spending for the laborers, it would be in this form. Okay, and here are some details of the Bush and Obama fiscal stimulus in response to the global financial crisis. So you can go through them. Now shifting to the questions and problems, and solve 2 problems for you, selected problems. So the selected problems and questions are, okay, selected questions and problems. Questions are 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. Okay, and the selected problems which you are responsible for, and you should practice on them, and will be very, very similar to the exams questions. So the problems are, first problem is included, and the 4th problem